Representative Austin Scott.
I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Dunn, for leading this effort. I know his district was hit probably harder than any other district in the United States. Madam Speaker, I rise today alongside many of my fellow colleagues to again stress the hardship many of our fellow Americans face following the devastating natural disasters of 2018. On October 10th, 2018, Hurricane Michael entered my home state of Georgia as a Category 3 storm. With it, we saw widespread damage from dangerous winds, flooding, and torrential rains. Hurricane Michael traced a path of destruction through south and middle Georgia, straddling both mine and Congressman Safford Bishop's districts. Our districts are largely rural areas that have also been hit hard by tornadoes and flooding in recent years. These areas are key to the state's agricultural sector, which is Georgia's #1 industry. Madam Speaker, the American farmer is the backbone of agriculture. Agriculture is Georgia's #1 industry. Fearing the worst of this storm, many farmers began harvesting what they could as Hurricane Michael crept closer and closer to Georgia. It was the best yields we'd seen in years for what was gathered before the storm hit. And after years of low commodity prices, unfair trade practices, labor shortages, and consecutive years of devastating storms, we needed it. Once Hurricane Michael hit, it was all gone. Not only did we lose billions of dollars in commodity crops like cotton and peanuts, but we lost orchards and forests that will take decades to regrow. Since the day after the storm, I worked side by side with my friend and colleague, Congressman Bishop, in an effort to bring our communities impacted by Hurricane Michael the tools they need to recover and rebuild. At every turn, we've worked together to bring attention to the crisis and to bring relief to these farmers alongside our other colleagues that have been impacted. The President and the Vice President personally came down and promised help. I was there. For months, we've stressed the magnitude of the damage to our colleagues, and for months, we've promised this was a priority for the White House and Congressional leadership from both sides of the aisle. Any bill to fund the government will have disaster relief. I don't know how many times I've heard it. I can't name all the people I heard it from. And as we stand here today, 6 months later, these can only be called empty promises. Never before have we seen American communities that were wrecked with the catastrophes neglected like this. Now, to this day, OMB hasn't even submitted a request for disaster assistance. Calls to White House staff have gone unheeded, and but for one tweet on April 1st, it seems the President has moved on. For months, I've received calls from farmers and the lenders they rely on that the financial impact of Hurricane Michael were becoming increasingly more difficult to bear. And then last week, the Senate showed how truly ugly and partisan politics have become, voting down a measure that would have brought billions in federal relief that communities in my home state of Georgia and around the country desperately need to get back on their feet again. Money to rebuild infrastructure and restore services, as well as farm aid. Certainly no one would have stood in the way of disaster relief for states like Vermont or New York. But rural Americans, we've been forgotten. We were forgotten again last week in the Senate's failure to pass disaster assistance. Well, rural Americans are Americans too, whether the press likes it or not, and whether certain members of the Senate like it or not. And they need our help to rebuild. And if the Senate cannot pass a bill to provide this federal disaster assistance, the bottom line is farm bankruptcies will continue, and I fear that the community banks and the businesses that support the farm sector will too. The truth is, if Hurricane Michael had hit Americans who weren't farmers, or farmers who aren't Americans, the stories of Washington's apathy to get things done would be the front page of every paper. Well, Mr. Speaker, the American farmers work day in and day out to feed and clothe America and the world. I urge the White House and the Congress to reverse their course of abandoning our farmers and keep the promises that you made to them. Madam Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time.
Madam Speaker, I thank my good friend Austin Scott for his words. He has truly been at the forefront of the fight for this disaster supplemental since day one. And now I would like